In a world where almost everyone is born with a superpower, what happens when a man shows up with nothing at all? No quirk to erase, no power to steal. The heroes scan him and find nothing harmless. They have no idea. Because this old man doesn't want a power of his own. He wants to understand where power comes from, and then he wants to build it. And in a world that decided, a long time ago, who deserves to be strong, that is the most dangerous idea of all. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's get into the story.
There was no fanfare to it, no thunderclap, no chorus of alarms, no dramatic crater smoking in the center of a plaza. One moment, Albert Wily was standing in the heart of his skull fortress with his hand on the reality lattice, watching the machine's output climb past every safe threshold he had ever bothered to observe. And the next, he was lying face down on cold, wet asphalt that smelled of rain and frying oil, in an alley that was not his, in a city that was not his, under a sky the wrong shade of gray. He lay still for a long moment. This was not, he would be the first to admit, dignified. His mustache was pressed flat against the ground, one of its white points bent at an angle that would take an hour to coax back into shape. His lab coat had soaked through at the elbows. Somewhere above him a machine hummed with a rhythm he did not recognize. An air conditioning unit, he would later learn, though at that moment his mind cataloged it as a possible generator, a possible threat, a possible resource. His mind cataloged everything as one of those three. It always had. He pushed himself up onto his knees, and then his feet, and took stock. The lattice device was gone. That was the first and worst fact, and he let it sit in him fully before he did anything else, because a lesser man would flinch from it, and a lesser man was not what the world had ever had the misfortune of dealing with. The device was gone. His fortress was gone. His robot masters, Metal Man with his cutting blades, Crash Man, Air Man, the whole beautiful lethal orchestra of them, were gone. Or rather, he was gone from them, flung somewhere they could not follow, could not be summoned, could not be rebuilt from the schematics he kept nowhere but the inside of his own skull. And that last thought was the one he chose to stand on, because the schematics were in his skull, his designs, his methods, 40 years of engineering that no one else on any world had ever matched, that had not been left behind. That had come with him, because it was him. Strip Albert Wily of everything, and what remained was the most dangerous thing in any room he had ever entered, and he suspected, straightening his ruined coat with as much ceremony as the alley allowed, that this room was going to be no different. He walked to the mouth of the alley and looked out at the street, and for the first time in his life Dr. Wily was genuinely, wordlessly astonished. It was a city. That much was ordinary. Tall buildings, wet streets, the shuffle and press of an evening crowd, screens the size of buildings selling things he couldn't parse. But the people. A woman walked past with skin, the deep translucent blue of sea glass, and where the streetlight caught her, she scattered it into rainbows across the pavement. A man haggling at a food stall had 4 arms, all of them in use, none of them remarkable to anyone around him. A child ran shrieking past on legs that ended not in feet but in small, precise wheels, weaving through the crowd with a delight that suggested this was simply how that child had always moved. Overhead, and Wily's neck craned up before he could stop it, a figure in garish costume flew, unassisted, no jetpack, no visible thrust, no wires, one gauntleted fist forward, and a cape snapping behind, and the crowd below barely glanced up. Wily stood in the alley mouth for a long time, and the engineer in him did what the engineer in him always did. It refused to accept magic. It refused to accept impossible. Every one of those people was doing something that violated a law he had built his entire life upon, and rather than despair, some cold and hungry part of him leaned forward. If it happens, he thought, it has a mechanism. And if it has a mechanism, he did not finish the thought out loud. He had learned over a career of being interrupted at the moment of triumph not to finish such thoughts out loud. He needed information, and he needed it without revealing himself. And so Dr. Wily did what he was extraordinarily good at, which was watching and stealing. He drifted along the edge of the crowd, an old man in a wet coat, invisible in the way old men often are, and he read. A discarded newspaper gave him a language he found he could parse, The warp had done something to him, some accommodation he did not question because questioning gifts was not efficient. A shop window full of glowing screens gave him faces and names, and slowly, over the course of that first strange evening, the shape of the world assembled itself in his mind with the terrible clarity of a schematic resolving out of noise. Quirks, that was the word for it. Nearly everyone had one, some trivial, some world-ending. Powers, native to the flesh, expressed differently in every body that carried one, inherited and mutated and blended down the generations. And around this simple biological fact, an entire civilization had grown up, a civilization of heroes. Licensed, ranked, numbered, merchandised, men and women who used their powers in public for money and adulation, arranged in a hierarchy as rigid as any Wily had ever schemed his way up, with a number one at the top of it whose flaming, scowling face was on half the screens in the district. Endeavor, the number one hero. And beneath the shine, Wily could always smell the rot beneath the shine. It was practically a quirk of his own. There was something raw and recent. The papers were full of it. A great hero, the greatest, the symbol of peace, had fallen from power some months ago. Not died, fallen, gone hollow. The whole society still trembled from it like a struck bell, and every screen that showed the flaming number one also, in the way it showed him, showed that he was a replacement, and everyone knew it. Wily filed that away with a slow, spreading interest. A society built on a single unbreakable pillar had just learned its pillar could break. That was not a stable society. That was a society with a crack running down the middle of it, and Albert Wily had spent his whole life learning where the cracks in things were, and how to put a wedge in them, and push. If you're the sort who enjoys watching a clever villain find the crack in a shining thing and lean on it, you already know where to put your cursor. The subscribe button's right there, and the whole point of this channel is that you pick what happens next. Name any universe and any character and drop it in the comments, and one of them becomes the next story. This one, The Good Doctor's Little Vacation in a World of Superpowers, was suggested by a viewer named Jeffrey, and it's written by me. Now, back to the alley, where an old man in a wet coat had just realized he was hungry and had no money, and was about to solve that problem the way he solved every problem. He solved it by finding a shuttered electronics repair shop 3 streets over, defeating its lock-in under a minute with a bent length of wire and an understanding of tumblers that no lock on this or any world had a defense against, and helping himself to a cold rice ball from the owner's small refrigerator, and a great deal more than that from the owner's tools. The shop belonged to a man named Kenji Sato, whose name Wily learned from the mail piled by the door and immediately forgot, because Kenji Sato was not relevant. Kenji Sato was merely a supplier who did not yet know he was a supplier. What was relevant was the workbench, and the soldering equipment, and the shelves of salvaged components, and above all the battered old terminal in the back that connected, Wily discovered with a thin smile, to the wider network of this world. He sat down at it, a rice ball in one hand and 40 years of unmatched genius behind his eyes, and he began to read in earnest. He read about Quirks until the sun came up. He read the popular explanations first and discarded them as the childish reassurances they were. And then he burrowed down, layer by layer, into the places where the actual researchers argued with each other, into pathology reports, into genetics papers, into the dry contested literature of quirk factors, the physical substrate in the body where a power lived. He read about a man, now imprisoned, now spoken of only in frightened footnotes, who had been able to take quirks out of people and give them to others, and Wily's hand went still on the mouse for a long, long moment. So it can be moved, he thought. It has already been done. If it can be moved, it can be copied. If it can be copied, it can be built. He did not sleep that night, or think about sleeping. He had found, in a world that had thrown away everything he owned, the single most interesting problem of his entire career. Not a superpower he could use. Wily had never wanted to fly or throw fire, had always found such men to be brutes and bores, had built his whole identity around being the mind that made the men who could. No, what this world was offering him was better than a power. It was a manufacturing problem. These people treated their powers as sacred accidents of birth, doled out by chance, hoarded, ranked, worshipped. They had built an entire trembling civilization on the belief that the ability was rare, that it came from inside, that it could not be given, only born. And Albert Wily, who had spent his life building the abilities of gods into steel and copper and giving them names, looked at that belief the way he looked at every locked door. By morning, he had a plan, and the beginnings of a lab, and a growing list of what he lacked. He needed real biological data, not the sanitized public kind. Tissue, scans, a quirk factor he could put under an instrument and take apart. He needed materials better than a repair shop's salvage. He needed, eventually, a place no hero would think to look, and money, and hands, and above all he needed to not be noticed by the licensed, ranked, celebrated enforcers of this world's fragile order until he was ready to be noticed on his own terms. He was aware, distantly, of the danger. He was an old man alone in an alien world with no army and no fortress and no robot masters. And this world had heroes, hundreds of them, thousands, some of whom, by the paper's own frightened accounts, could level city blocks. Any one of them could end him in an afternoon, if they found him and understood what he was doing. But they would have to understand it first, and that, Wily thought, tightening the last screw on a jury-rigged diagnostic rig cobbled from a repair shop's guts at 4 a.m, that was the beautiful thing. Their whole apparatus of control was built for one kind of threat: villains with powers. They had erasers who could switch a quirk off, and a jailed monster who could steal one, and licenses and registries and rankings all designed around the assumption that power lived in a person and could be measured, cataloged, and countered. He had no quirk to erase, no power to steal. No registry had a category for a man whose only weapon was that he understood how power worked better than the people who were born with it. When they finally came for him, and they would scan him, the way they scanned everyone, and they would find nothing at all. An ordinary old man, harmless. The thought made him laugh, alone in the back of a stolen shop, a dry, unpleasant sound that startled a moth off the ceiling. He caught himself, straightened, smoothed the bent point of his mustache back toward True. There would be time for laughing later. First there was work, an ocean of it, more and better work than he had been handed in decades. He pulled the salvage terminal closer, opened the deepest of the research archives he had cracked his way into overnight, and began to sketch, on the back of Kenji Sato's unpaid invoices, in the cramped, brilliant shorthand that only he could read, the very first draft of a thing this world had decided, in its comfortable arrogance, was impossible. A quirk designed, from scratch, to be installed not in a child, not in a chosen successor, not in flesh at all, in a machine. Outside, the city that did not know his name yet was waking up. Trains ran. Heroes clocked in for their patrols, capes bright against the gray morning. In a tower across the city, the #1 hero was already at his desk, buried in the paperwork of holding up a sky that had recently proven it could fall. And in a locked repair shop that its owner would open 2 hours late to find, inexplicably, his best tools warm and his refrigerator raided. An old man with white hair combed up into 2 great horns bent over a stolen invoice and smiled at a mechanism no one else had ever thought to question. He had lost everything. He had never in his life been more dangerous. The mistake, when he made it, was almost invisible, and that was what unsettled him afterward, because Albert Wily did not make invisible mistakes. Careless ones, sometimes. Theatrical ones, always. But not invisible. 3 weeks into his new life, he had outgrown Kenji Sato's repair shop the way a hermit crab outgrows a shell, quietly and without gratitude, and moved his operation to the sub-basement of a condemned textile factory on the industrial edge of Musutafu, a district where the buildings sagged and the streetlights failed, and no hero on any patrol roster wasted his evenings. It suited him. It reminded him, faintly, of home. He had power siphoned illegally off a municipal line, a workspace assembled from salvage and theft, and, the crown of 3 weeks' patient burglary, a functioning quirk factor analyzer, built by his own hands from schematics he had reverse-engineered out of stolen medical hardware, and improved, because he could not help improving anything he touched. What he did not have was a sample. That was the problem that drove him out into the night, and that was where the invisible mistake began. He needed quirk tissue, living, ideally, or at least fresh, and the honest routes to it were all watched. Hospitals had registries, clinics logged their waste, even the black markets of this world, which he had located with depressing ease, dealt in quirk products rather than the raw factor he wanted, and dealing with them meant being seen, remembered, described. So he had gone hunting for a specific kind of clinic, an unlicensed one, the sort that treated the injuries powered criminals could not explain to a real doctor, because such a place would have exactly what he needed, and exactly no incentive to report its loss. He had found one. He had cased it for 2 nights. And on the 3rd night, moving through the alley behind it with a cold storage case under his arm, and his mind entirely on the retrieval ahead, Dr. Wily walked directly past a pile of refuse that was not a pile of refuse. That's far enough. The voice came from the dark at ground level, low and flat, and profoundly tired, and Wily's whole body went still. The refuse unfolded. It became a man, lean, unshaven, wrapped in a scarf of some gray fibrous material that seemed to move slightly on its own, with long black hair hanging in his face and eyes that, when they came up, were bloodshot and utterly without warmth. He rose from where he had been crouched against the wall, with the boneless economy of something that spent a great deal of its time waiting motionless in dark places, and Wily understood, with a lurch, exactly what he was looking at. A hero. Not a bright one. Not a flying, gauntleted showman with a merchandise line. A hunter. The kind they sent when they wanted a thing found in the dark and dealt with quietly, and the kind, therefore, who had been watching this alley for the same reason Wily had come to it. Sloppy, Wily thought, with the cold clarity that always came to him in the worst moments. You knew the clinic was watched. You knew it, and you came anyway, because you were impatient. This is impatience. This is what impatience costs. You've been circling this block for 3 nights, the tired man said. He hadn't moved closer. He didn't seem to feel any need to. Old man, alone, wrong clothes, wrong walk. You're not a customer, and you're not a patient, so. He tilted his head a fraction. What are you? It was, Wily would reflect much later, a genuinely good question, and one the man had no idea he'd asked. I'm lost, Wily said, and let his voice do the thing his voice could do, going thin and querulous and old, the harmless confusion of an elderly man who had wandered somewhere he shouldn't. I was looking for there's a pharmacy, my prescription. He let it trail, let his free hand flutter. Is this not, where am I? The tired eyes did not so much as flicker. No, the hero said, try again. And then he did the thing. Wily felt it before he understood it, a shift in the air, the specific attention of the man sharpening to a point, and those bloodshot eyes fixing on him and widening, the long hair lifting faintly, as though on a static charge. Wily had read about this. 3 weeks of burrowing through the archives had taught him the top pro's powers as a matter of professional necessity, and he recognized this one instantly from the descriptions, recognized the scarf and the sleepless face, and above all the eyes, Eraserhead, the underground hero whose quirk did not throw fire or shatter concrete, but did something far more surgical. It switched other quirks off. Look at a powered man, and his power simply stopped. No fire, no flight, no strength, nothing, for as long as those red eyes held him. In a world of quirks, it was the perfect hunter's tool. It stripped the dangerous down to merely human, and then the merely human could be handled. Wily's stomach dropped, because in the half-second before his mind caught up, his body reacted as anyone's would. The animal certainty that something had just been done to him, that he had been disarmed, that he stood exposed and powerless before a predator. And then his mind caught up, and Dr. Albert Wily nearly laughed, because nothing had happened, nothing at all. The red eyes were locked on him with the full force of a quirk that had unmade the powers of villains who could level buildings, and Wily felt precisely the same as he had felt a moment before, which was to say, cold, exposed, and entirely himself. There was nothing in him to switch off. No quirk factor sat coiled in his cells waiting to be silenced. He was, by the measure of this world and this man's power, blank, an ordinary human being with an ordinary human body, and the most sophisticated quirk detection instrument the hero profession possessed was aimed directly at him and returning nothing. He watched it happen on the other man's face. He watched Eraserhead's certainty falter. Because a real ordinary old man would have shown no reaction to being erased at all. You cannot switch off a power that isn't there. And a quirkless man simply stands there unchanged. That was consistent with what the hero saw. But the hero's instincts, honed over a career of reading the flicker of fear in cornered powered criminals, were telling him something else. They were telling him this old man was dangerous. Everything about the setup, the casing, the case under his arm, the wrongness of him, screamed threat. And the quirk said quirkless. The two readings did not fit together, and Wily watched, fascinated despite the danger, as a man who had built his entire methodology on those eyes ran headlong into the one thing they could not explain. Nothing, Eraserhead said. It was almost too quiet to hear. He wasn't talking to Wily. He was talking to himself, the way a man does when an instrument he has trusted for 20 years gives him a reading he cannot accept. You're quirkless. I keep telling you, Wily quavered. I'm just an old... No. And now the hero did move closer. One slow step, and his hand had come up to the capture weapon at his throat, the gray scarf stirring, and the exhaustion had burned off his face entirely, and left something much sharper underneath. A quirkless old man who's cased a criminal clinic for 3 nights doesn't stand like that when I light him up. You didn't flinch from the erasure. You flinched from me. You know exactly what I just tried to do to you. The red eyes narrowed. And it didn't do anything, because there's nothing in you to erase. But you're not. He couldn't finish it, and Wily understood why, and it was in that moment, pinned in a filthy alley by a man who could have restrained him in a heartbeat, that Dr. Wily felt the first genuine thrill of this whole ridiculous exile, because he was watching a professional's worldview crack in real time. The man's entire framework had 2 boxes: has a quirk, is therefore dangerous and can be shut off, and has no quirk, is therefore harmless. And Wily fit neither. He was the third thing, the thing the framework did not have a shape for. Harmless by every measurement the profession had ever built, and dangerous in a way none of those measurements could touch, because the danger was not in him, it was in what he knew. They had, Wily thought, with a satisfaction so deep it was almost warmth, built their whole cage for the wrong animal. Put down the case, Eraserhead said, slowly, and you're going to tell me your name, and then you're going to tell me what an old man with no quirk wants with a clinic that patches up powered criminals. For one long moment, the alley was very quiet. Wily waited. He was not a fool, and he did not overrate himself in a fight. He had no fight. That was the entire point of his existence. He was a man who built the things that fought. If this man decided to bind him and drag him to a station, Wily could not physically prevent it. His mind raced through the options with the cold speed it always found in a corner. The cold storage case had a coolant line he could rupture into a blinding cloud. There was a fire escape 9 meters back with a rusted counterweight. The streetlight above them ran on the same failing municipal grid he'd been stealing from, and he knew precisely which junction box fed it. He chose the junction box. My name, Wily said, drawing himself up, letting the querulous old man fall away just enough to make the hero's grip tighten on the scarf, is not something you're going to write in a report tonight. His thumb was already on the small remote in his coat pocket, a thing he had built in his first week and carried everywhere out of 40 years' habit, because Albert Wily did not walk into any situation without a way to turn the lights out. He had wired a dozen of the district's failing junction boxes to it as a matter of principle, mapping the grid's weaknesses the way he mapped every environment he entered. He pressed it. The alley went black. Not just the one street light, the whole failing block of them, a cascade Wily had set up without ever quite planning to use, the grid stuttering down street by street in the industrial dark. It bought him no more than 4 seconds against a man whose eyes were made for the dark, and Wily did not waste them being clever. He ruptured the coolant line, filling the space between them with a hissing white fog of vaporized refrigerant, dropped the empty case, and ran, not toward the fire escape, which was obvious, but low and sideways toward a storm drain he had noted on his first night casing the block, because Albert Wily always noted the exits first and the objective second. Behind him he heard the whip crack of the capture weapon lashing through fog and finding nothing, heard a curse, heard the tired voice, no longer tired at all, bark something into a radio. He didn't stop to listen. He folded his old body into the storm drain with an indignity he would resent for weeks, and was gone into the dark beneath the city, and the last thing he took with him, more valuable than any tissue sample, was the memory of that face. The way the certainty had drained out of it. The way the most feared pair of eyes in the underground had looked at Albert Wily and found nothing to switch off, and had been, for one honest instant, afraid. Aizawa Shota stood in the dispersing fog with his radio in his hand and did not chase. He could have. The old man was slow, the drains were a maze but a mappable one, and Aizawa had run down faster prey through worse terrain. But something held him where he stood, staring at the abandoned cold storage case at his feet, and it took him a moment to name it, because it had been a long time since he'd felt it on the job. He was unnerved. He crouched and looked at the case without touching it. Cheap, salvaged, modified. Someone had rebuilt the cooling system by hand, and rebuilt it well, better than the factory unit. With a craftsman's economy he didn't have the vocabulary to appreciate, but could recognize on sight, the way you recognize competence in any field. This was not a random vagrant. This was somebody who made things, and who had come to a criminal clinic in the dead of night to take something out of it in a cold box. And when Aizawa had erased him, had looked right at him with the quirk that had never once failed to tell him what he was facing, the world had told him the man was nobody. Quirkless, an ordinary human being with nothing to shut off. Aizawa had built 20 years of survival on the principle that a switched-off enemy was a safe enemy. Erase the quirk, and the flying man falls. The strong man is just a man. The monster is meat. It was the one certainty his dangerous profession had given him. And tonight he had switched off an enemy who had never been switched on, and been more afraid of him after than before. He keyed the radio again, slower this time, and his voice when it came out was flat and cold and careful. This is Eraserhead. I need eyes on the industrial sector, and I need someone to pull every camera between here and the textile district for the last month. He looked down the black street where the old man had gone. I've got a quirkless problem, and I don't like the shape of it. Aizawa's pursuit changed nothing about Wily's timeline except its urgency, and Wily had always done his best work under a deadline. He abandoned the textile factory the same night, dragged what mattered out through the storm drains in 3 exhausting trips before dawn, cursing his own body the whole way, and left behind a workspace scrubbed of anything that could be traced. By the time a hero team swept the sub-basement 2 days later, they found bare concrete, the ghost marks of removed equipment, and a single deliberate insult, a child's toy robot, store-bought, sitting in the center of the floor with its little arms raised, which the forensics team photographed for 6 hours before concluding it meant nothing. It meant a great deal. It meant Albert Wily had time, on the worst night of his exile, to be petty. He considered that a sign of good spirits. His new lair was worse and better, a flooded machine shop beneath an abandoned rail depot even further out, harder to reach, colder, but genuinely forgotten in a way the textile factory had only pretended to be. And it was here, with the analyzer reassembled and humming and the water lapping at the edges of his workspace, that Dr. Wily finally got what the whole enterprise had been for, a sample. He had not, in the end, gone back to a clinic. The alley had taught him that the honest routes were watched, and Wily's version of learning a lesson was to invent a route no one was watching. He built a thing, small, ugly, brilliant, that he thought of privately as a harvester, though it was really just a modified medical device with an ethics module he had removed on principle. And he did not use it on a hero or a villain or anyone would miss. He used it on himself, first, to calibrate it, drawing his own ordinary human tissue and confirming that the analyzer read it as blank, no quirk factor, the same nothing Aizawa's eyes had found. Then he used it on a rat. This world's rats had quirks. Of course they did. The quirk phenomenon had swept through the whole tree of life, and the vermin of Musutafu were no exception. The one he caught in the flooded dark of the rail depot had a minor, useless power. It could make its own body faintly luminous, a soft green glow it used, presumably, to attract the insects it ate. A contemptible little quirk, a perfect first specimen, something no registry tracked, no hero protected, and no one on any world would ever come looking for. He killed it quickly. He was not sentimental, but he was not gratuitous either. Cruelty for its own sake bored him, and he put the quirk factor under his instruments, and for the first time in his life, Albert Wily looked directly at the physical thing that this entire trembling civilization had built itself upon, and had decided, in its comfortable arrogance, could not be built. It took him 9 days. 9 days. In a flooded machine shop, living on stolen food and less sleep than a man his age should survive, bent over readouts until his eyes burned. And at the end of the 9 days, he understood the quirk factor the way he understood a circuit. He understood what it was. Not a soul, not a gift, not a sacred accident, a structure. A biological mechanism of appalling elegance, yes, he gave it that. He was a great enough engineer to bow to elegant design when he found it. But a mechanism, with inputs and outputs and a governing logic, sitting in the cell like a program in a chip, expressing a power according to rules that could be read and mapped, and his hands shook slightly as he thought it, and he was not a man whose hands shook, rewritten. The researchers of this world had gotten so close. He read their papers again with something almost like pity. They had mapped the quirk factor's structure. They had proven, via the imprisoned monster's stolen abilities, that a factor could be moved from body to body. They had every piece, and they had stopped at the edge of the obvious conclusion. All of them. Every credentialed genius in the field, because they were prisoners of a belief so deep they couldn't see it was a belief. That the quirk factor belonged in living flesh, that it was a thing bodies did, that you might move it from one body to another, as the monster in Tartarus had, but that it required a body, a warm, breathing, evolved substrate, to exist at all. Wily set down his instruments, in the 9th day dark, and said aloud to the lapping water and the rusting machines, in the tone of a man delivering a verdict, "No, it doesn't." Because he had seen, in the structure of the rat's pathetic glow, the thing they were all too reverent to see. The quirk factor didn't need the flesh. The flesh was just the substrate it had evolved in. The factor was, at bottom, an information structure, a pattern that governed the expression of an effect, and information did not care what it was written on. He had spent his entire career writing the abilities of gods into steel and copper. He had built machines that flew, that burned, that cut, that shattered stone, and he had never once needed a quirk to do it, only physics and genius. And now this world was handing him a shortcut, a way to write not the crude imitation of a power but the power itself, the actual quirk factor, its actual biological logic, transcribed off the flesh it evolved in and onto a substrate of his own design. Not a robot that mimicked a quirk, a robot that had one. A quirk factor, real, functional, expressing its effect, housed not in a child chosen by chance, but in a chassis chosen by him, built to his specification, obedient to his will, and reproducible. Reproducible. That was the word that made his breath go shallow. A born hero was a one-off, an accident, unrepeatable. But a quirk transcribed to an engineerable substrate could be copied, printed, installed in a second unit, and a third, and a 100th. The scarcity that this entire civilization ran on, the preciousness, the rankings, the worship of the rare and the mighty, was, he saw now, an artifact of biology, an accident of the delivery mechanism. Remove that accident, manufacture the delivery, and every single thing that made a hero special evaporated. Because you could make 10,000 of anything you could make one of. He sat with that for a long time, in the cold and the dark and the smell of standing water. And he was not laughing. It was too big for laughing. This was the sort of thing that came to a man once in a career, if he was very great and very lucky, the problem that redefined the field, and it had been handed to him not in his own world where he was hunted and hemmed by his rival, but here, in exile, with nothing to lose and no Thomas Light to stop him. He thought then, of the men who ran this world, the flaming number one at his desk, the eraser with the tired eyes, out there right now pulling camera footage, hunting a quirkless old man he couldn't categorize, the imprisoned monster in Tartarus, who had stolen quirks and been the greatest terror the age had known, and Wily felt, thinking of him, a professional's disdain. Stealing. How small. How limited. A thief could only ever redistribute what already existed. Take a quirk from one man and it was gone from him. A zero-sum little crime. Powerful but bounded. The whole hero apparatus was built to counter exactly that. The thief. the monster who concentrated power in himself. Wily didn't want to concentrate it. He wanted to print it. And there was no cage in this world built for that. They had erasers for the powered, and jails for the thief, and registries for the born. They had nothing, nothing at all, for a man who could sit in the dark and write the thing they thought only God and biology could grant. When they came for him, and they would come, they would scan him and find an ordinary old man, and they would be looking, always, for the power in the person. It would not occur to them, until far too late, that the person was empty and the power was in the workshop. He rose, joints protesting, and crossed to the workbench where the beginnings of a chassis lay in pieces. Crude, a first attempt, cobbled from salvage. Nothing like the elegant, lethal robot masters of home. It didn't matter that it was crude. Michelangelo's first sketch was still Michelangelo's. What mattered was the thing he was about to install in it. The transcribed factor glowing faintly in its housing on the bench. The rat's contemptible little glow lifted off the rat and written onto a substrate of copper and rare earth, waiting for a body. His first. The proof. Not a weapon yet, not a threat. Nothing that would trouble even a rookie hero. Just a machine that would, when he switched it on, do a thing this civilization had built its entire self-image, on the certainty that machines could not do. It would have a quirk. They named the whole world after you being an accident, Wily murmured, fitting the housing into the half-built chassis with the tenderness of a man who loved exactly one thing, and it was his own work. Born or stolen. Those were the only two doors. Nobody bothered to build a third. He picked up his tools. So I built one. Across the city, in a bright office that smelled of the disinfectant, a large flaming man used compulsively when he was stressed. Aizawa Shota laid a single sheet of paper on the desk of the #1 hero and waited while Endeavor read it. It was thin. A month of camera pulling and canvassing had produced almost nothing, which was itself the disturbing part. An elderly male, quirkless by erasure, connected to 3 separate break-ins at electronics and medical suppliers, and 1 aborted approach to a criminal clinic. No name, no prints on file, no registry match, not as a hero, not as a villain, not as a citizen, which in a society that tracked every quirk from birth was very nearly impossible. A person with no quirk and no record and no past, moving through the industrial dark, stealing tools and cooling equipment, and 1 very specific piece of medical hardware whose purpose the analysts had flagged with a note that had put a cold weight in Aizawa's chest when he read it. Consistent with quirk factor extraction, Endeavor set the paper down. The fire at his jaw had gone low and steady, the way it did when he was thinking rather than posturing. A quirkless old man, he said, stealing the equipment to take quirks out of people. He looked up. You're telling me we've got a second all-for-one? No, Aizawa said, and it was the certainty in his own voice that unsettled him most, because he could not yet prove it, could only feel it, the way he'd felt it in the fog of that alley. All for one I'd understand. All for one I could put in a box. And this is something else. He nodded at the paper. All for one took power out of people and kept it for himself. Whatever this is, I don't think he wants to keep it. Endeavor frowned. Then what does he want it for? Aizawa didn't have an answer. He wouldn't have one for weeks. But standing in that bright, disinfected office, he thought of the rebuilt cooling unit in that abandoned case, the craftsman's economy of it, the hands of someone who made things. And for the second time, a chill he couldn't name walked up the back of his neck. I don't know, he said, but he's not stealing power to have it. He's stealing it to learn it. The League found him before the heroes did, which was, Wily reflected afterward, exactly the wrong order for everyone but him. They found him because he let them. It was a calculated thing, though it did not look like one from the outside. Wily had spent his first weeks avoiding attention with the reflexes of a hunted man, and the alley with the eraser had taught him that the hero's web, however ill-suited to catch him, was real and wide and closing. What he needed was resources faster than theft could supply. Real materials, real space, real hands. And there was. He had come to understand from his deep burrowing through this world's underside, exactly one buyer in Musutafu with money, and no scruples, and a standing unmet hunger for a man who could make impossible things. So he made himself findable. Not to the heroes. to the other side. He let one of his supply thefts go a little loud. He left, at the sight, another of his small, insulting signatures. Not the toy robot this time, but a thing more legible to the right audience. A scrap of transcribed Quirk Factor housing, dead and harmless but unmistakably wrong. A piece of engineering no legitimate lab produced. Bait for someone clever enough to recognize it, and connected enough to come looking. And someone was, and someone did. They came to the flooded rail depot 4 nights later, and Wily, who had of course wired the approaches, watched them arrive on a bank of salvaged screens, with the detached interest of a man observing specimens. There were 3, a pale young man with cracked, chapped skin and hands he held oddly, splayed, careful, as though touching the world too fully would cost something. And it would, Wily knew from the archives, because he had made a point of learning the shape of this world's rising darkness, the same way he'd learned its heroes. Shigaraki Tomura, the heir to the imprisoned monster, decay in his hands, disintegration on contact, the coming apex of the League of Villains, and, Wily noted with clinical interest, young, younger than his reputation. Raw where he should have been finished, a blade still being ground. Beside him a man whose whole head was living blue-white flame, patchwork skin stapled and stitched below it, moving with the loose insolence of someone who had already decided how the meeting would go. Dabi, and behind them both a shape of warp and shadow, a scattered mist of eyes and gaping black portals. Kurogiri, the exit, the way in and the way out, the reason the League could be anywhere and gone before the heroes closed. They picked their way through the flooded dark toward the light of his workshop, and Shigaraki called out into it in a voice like dry paper tearing. "You wanted us to find you." Not a question. The boy was sharper than his youth. "The trash you left was a message, so here we are." A pause, and something that might have been the shape of a smile under the pale hair. "Say something interesting, old man, or Dabi burns the water off this hole with you in it." Wily stepped into his own light where they could see him, and he did not perform the frightened old man this time, because these were not police to be misdirected. These were customers, and Albert Wily knew, better than he knew anything, how to open with a customer. "You're the boy the monster in Tartarus is grooming to inherit the world," he said, pleasantly, and watched the flippancy go out of Shigaraki's posture at the word boy. "Decay, everything you touch, unmade, a magnificent quirk, truly, the pinnacle of a certain kind of thinking." He let that sit, let the certain kind of thinking land like the small insult it was. "And do you know what its limit is? Its one, fatal, permanent limit?" Dabi's flame guttered with amusement. "This should be good. There's one of it," Wily said. "One quirk, in one body, yours, when you die, and heroes are very motivated to arrange that. It's gone, or it passes to a single successor, the way it passed to you. Your master spent 100 years hoarding power into himself, one stolen quirk at a time, building the single most dangerous individual the world has ever produced." He spread his hands. And what did it get him? A cell, because a civilization that fears a mighty individual knows exactly how to build a box for one. They've been perfecting that box for 100 years. It's the only threat they understand. The mist of Kurogiri shifted. Shigaraki had gone very still, and the stillness was listening. "So what?" the boy rasped. "You're a better hoarder?" "I'm not a hoarder at all." Wily turned, unhurried, and gestured them toward the workbench, toward the crude chassis that had lain in pieces 9 days ago and now stood assembled. Ugly, squat, no taller than a child, plated in mismatched salvage, dead and dark and waiting. Hoarding is a thief's game, and thieves think small. Your master could take a quirk from a man and it was gone from that man forever. A zero-sum little theft. One power moved from one pocket to another. Powerful. Bounded. He laid a hand on the chassis's cold shoulder, almost fond. "I don't take. I don't move. I make. And what I make, I can make again." He threw the switch. The little machine came alive with a stutter and a hum. It straightened on its stubby legs, sensor cluster brightening, and for a moment it simply stood there, an unremarkable, ugly salvage robot in a flooded room, and Wily saw Dabi's flame flicker with open contempt at the anticlimax of it. And then the machine glowed, and a soft green luminescence rose off its plating, gentle, alive, spilling faint light across the black water at its feet, the exact contemptible glow of a dead rat lifted off the rat and written into copper and steel, a useless power, a trivial one. Deliberately, insultingly trivial, because Wily had chosen it precisely so that its triviality would sharpen the point. The room went silent, except for the lap of water. That machine, Wily said quietly, into that silence, has a quirk. A real one, not a copy, not a gadget, not a light I wired to a battery. A quirk factor, the same structure your master spent a century stealing out of human beings, transcribed off the flesh it grew in and written into a substrate I designed. Your erasers can't switch it off, because their power reaches for a human nervous system, and there isn't one. Your Tartarus can't cage it, because you can't jail a schematic, and its power, he tapped the glowing plate, is the most worthless quirk I could find. On purpose. Because I wanted you to understand that it was never about this quirk. He turned to face them fully, and for the first time let them see the whole of it in his face, the thing that made lesser men in his own world flee the room. It was about proving I can put any of them in any of these, as many as I want, 100 machines, 1,000, each one carrying a quirk I chose and built and can build again tomorrow. The heroes have spent 100 years learning to fear the one mighty man. They have no box, no eraser, no law, no idea for an army where every soldier is manufactured and every power is printed, and there is no single throat to cut to end it. He let the smile come now, the real one. Your master wanted to rule this world, boy. I can flood it. Shigaraki Tomura stared at the glowing machine for a long, long moment. When he spoke, the dry paper rasp had changed. Some of the sullen boredom burned off it, replaced by something hungrier, something that had glimpsed a shape it wanted. Sensei never talked about anything like this, he murmured. And then, sharper, the covetousness of a boy who had spent his life being handed his power rather than earning it. You'll build them for us, for the League. You'll... No, Wily said it flatly, and the flat refusal landed harder in that room than any threat could have, because you did not simply tell Shigaraki Tomura no. Dabi's flame flared. Kurogiri's portals gaped a fraction wider. Wily did not so much as glance at them. I will work with you, he said. Understand the difference, because your continued usefulness to me depends on you understanding it. You have things I need, money, materials, space, hands, and a talent for drawing the hero's attention to your dramatics, and away from my workshop. I have the one thing that can turn your little band of the aggrieved into the thing that ends hero society for good. That's a partnership. It is not a leash. The moment you reach for a leash, he nodded, mild at the glowing machine. Remember that I am the only man alive who knows how to build these, that the knowledge is in here. He tapped his temple, and nowhere else, and that a corpse builds nothing. Your master understood leverage. Try to be half as clever as your master. It was, by any sane measure, an insane thing to say to three of the most dangerous killers in the city, while standing alone and unarmed in a flooded room. Dabi looked genuinely delighted, the way a man is delighted when someone else is about to die entertainingly. And for one held breath it could have gone either way. Wily could see it, could see the boy's chapped hand twitch toward him, all 5 fingers, the disintegrating touch a hand's breadth from being used. And Shigaraki Tomura laughed. A raw, ugly, surprised sound, and he lowered the hand. Sensei would have killed you for that, he said, for talking to me like that. He tilted his head, studying the old man the way he'd study a new game, whose rules he hadn't learned yet. But Sensei's in a box, and you just told me why. The not-quite smile again. All right, old man, a partnership. Kurogiri gets you what you ask for. You build, and the first time I think you've stopped being useful, I turn you to dust in your sleep. The first time I think you've stopped being useful, Wily said, already turning back to his bench, already done with the conversation, already thinking about materials and space, and the 20 better chassis he could build, now that hands and money were coming. You'll wake up to find every machine I've built for you doesn't answer to you at all. Shall we both simply agree to remain useful? Behind him, in the flooded dark, the villain who would one day inherit the world looked at the softly glowing machine and felt, for the first time since his master's capture, that the future had cracked open into something new, and did not yet grasp that he had just agreed to hold the ladder for a man who intended to climb straight past him. The green light rose and fell on the black water, patient as a heartbeat. The League's resources changed everything, and they changed it fast, in the way that a great engineer starved of materials for months will detonate into productivity the moment the constraint is lifted. Kurogiri's portals turned Wily's supply problem into an afterthought. What had cost him weeks of burglary and nerve now cost a request and a night's wait. Rare earth stock, machine tools, precision instruments, a proper power supply. All of it slid out of a warp of black mist onto the floor of a new workshop the League had bought him through a chain of shells no hero would untangle in a year. The flooded rail depot was abandoned for a decommissioned pumping station on the industrial river, dry and vast and dead, with cranes still bolted to the ceiling, and a floor Wily could finally spread out on. Money he did not have to steal, space he did not have to hide in. And hands, a rotating handful of the League's lower foot soldiers, sullen-powered criminals whom Wily treated with exactly the courtesy he'd shown Kenji Sato's tools, which was none, and who learned within a day not to touch anything on his benches and not to ask what the machines were for. He built. The first weeks of it were the happiest of his exile, and Wily was honest enough with himself to know why. It was not the plotting, though he enjoyed the plotting. It was the work. For the first time since the lattice device had thrown him out of his own life, he had a real fabrication floor under his hands and a real problem worth the whole of him, and he fell into it the way he had fallen into his first workshop as a young man, before the grudges and the failures and the long humiliating history of being second. Here there was no Thomas Light. Here there was no rival to be measured against. No golden boy whose robots the world loved while it feared Wily's own. Here there was only the problem, and the problem was glorious. And Albert Wily was, when you stripped away the theater and the spite, one of the 2 or 3 finest engineers any world had ever produced. He remembered that, at the pumping station. He remembered it in his hands. He refined the transcription process until it was reliable. He learned to read a quirk factor faster, to lift it cleaner, to write it onto a substrate with less loss. He solved the housing problem, the interface problem, the power problem, how to feed a manufactured quirk enough energy to express at full strength without cooking the chassis around it. A problem this world's researchers had never had to solve because a human body solved it for free, metabolically, invisibly, and which Wily solved instead with engineering, brute and elegant by turns. Every solution taught him 3 new things. Every new thing suggested 5 better designs. He filled notebook after notebook in his cramped, brilliant shorthand, and he slept 4 hours a night and resented every one of them. And slowly, out of the salvage and the theory, the first real one took shape. Not the crude, glowing proof of concept he'd shown the League. That ugly little thing had done its job and now sat dead in a corner, a museum piece. This was different. This was the first machine Wily built the right way, from the chassis up, designed around the quirk instead of having the quirk bolted into whatever salvage was handy. He built it tall and lean, humanoid, armored in dark plate, and he agonized over it the way he had once agonized over Metal Man and Quick Man and all the beautiful lethal children of his old life. Because a robot master was not merely a weapon to Wily. It never had been. It was a statement. And this one was the first sentence of an argument he intended to make to an entire civilization. For its quirk, he did not choose something trivial this time. He chose from the samples the League had helped him acquire, bought, extorted, or taken from powered criminals whom no one would miss, and whom Wily did not permit himself to think about too closely, because sentiment was inefficient and the ones he took from were not innocents. He chose a factor with genuine offensive potential, a concussive force quirk. The ability to project directed shockwaves of kinetic energy, strong enough to buckle a wall. In the man Wily had transcribed it from, it had been a middling power, throttled by that man's poor durability and worse imagination. Written into a chassis Wily built specifically to withstand its own recoil, fed by a power supply that put a human metabolism to shame, aimed by targeting systems that never flinched and never tired. The same quirk became something its original owner could never have dreamed of. That was the thing the researchers had never understood, and the thing that would take the heroes far too long to grasp. A quirk in a human being was limited by the human being, by their body, their nerve, their fear, their fatigue, their reluctance to be hurt. Take the quirk off the human and put it in a machine built for nothing but that quirk's perfect expression, and you did not get the same power. You got the power unchained from every weakness of the flesh it had grown in. Wily was not merely making quirks reproducible, he was making them better, the way he had always made everything better, by removing the sloppy accident of biology and replacing it with intent. He named it, when it was done, in the privacy of his own head, because a thing you had made deserved a name, and Wily had never in his life built a machine he did not name. In his own world he had numbered them and titled them, Cutman, Gutsman, the whole gallery. Here, in a world of Japanese hero names and evocative code names, he permitted himself something that fit the setting and pleased his sense of theater. He called it Ryusei, Meteor, for the way its shockwaves would fall. And on the night he finished it, he did not switch it on for the League, he switched it on alone. He stood in the vast dark of the pumping station, with the river murmuring against the outer walls, and he threw the switch, and Ryusei opened its optics for the first time and looked at its maker, and Wily felt the old feeling, the one no rival, and no failure, and no exile had ever quite managed to kill in him. The feeling of a father. He knew it was ridiculous. He had always known it was ridiculous. He had built things whose only purpose was destruction, and loved them anyway, fiercely, more than he had ever loved a person. And if that was a broken thing to be, then he had made his peace with the break decades ago. "There you are," he said softly, to the machine. "There you are." Ryusei took a step, then another. It raised one arm, and at Wily's murmured command, it turned toward the far wall of the pumping station, an old concrete pillar thick enough to hold up the ceiling, and fired. The shock wave crossed the room with a sound like the sky clearing its throat. The pillar did not crack, it ceased, the near face of it detonating into gravel and dust, a crater a meter deep, punched into structural concrete by a quirk that in its original owner had been strong enough to knock a man down. Wily felt the pressure of it in his chest across the whole width of the room. Dust rained from the cranes above. The echo rolled out over the river and came back. Wily stood in the settling dust and looked at what he had made, and he was not laughing, and he was not gloating, and there was no one there to perform for. There was only the machine, and the crater, and the long, slow certainty settling into him like sediment. It worked. Not the theory. The theory had worked for weeks. This, the whole thing. A quirk, born in a human being, lifted off the flesh and written into steel and made stronger, housed in a body that answered only to him, that no eraser could switch off, and no thief could steal, and no Tartarus could hold, and that he could build again, could build 100 of, 1,000 of, an army of, each one carrying a power he chose, printed and reproducible, and utterly outside every defense 100 years of hero society had ever devised. He thought, standing there, of the flaming man at his desk, of the tired man with the erasing eyes, still out there somewhere hunting an old man he couldn't categorize, of the fallen symbol, the great hollow hero whose fall had cracked this whole civilization down the middle and shown it that its pillars could break. They had no idea, not one of them, not the number one, not the eraser, not the boy villain holding the ladder without knowing whose ladder it was. They were all still looking, always, for the power in the person, scanning bodies, fearing individuals, building boxes for the one mighty man. And here in the dark by the river, an ordinary old man with nothing in his cells for any eraser to find, had just built the first soldier of an army that would render every one of their defenses a museum piece. "They'll scan me and find nothing," Wily said aloud, to Ryusei, to the crater, to the river, to the whole sleeping ignorant city beyond the walls. "They always will. That's the joke of it. The most dangerous man in this world, and their every instrument agrees I'm harmless." He reached up and coaxed the bent point of his mustache toward True, an old habit, a small vanity, and for once he let himself smile the whole way. "The power was never supposed to be in me, you see. That was their mistake. That was always going to be their mistake." Ryusei stood silent and dark and waiting in the ruined dust, the first of a new line, and its maker turned back to his benches, because one was a proof, and an army was the point, and Albert Wily had a very great deal of work still to do. Outside, the river ran on toward the sea, carrying the concrete dust away into the dark, and no hero anywhere in the sleeping city felt the ground shift beneath the thing they had all been standing on. Not yet. The heroes did not learn the truth from a crater or a captured machine or a confession. They learned it the way institutions always learn the things that frighten them most, slowly, from paperwork, assembled by a functionary too junior to be ignoring the pattern and too stubborn to stop pulling the thread. Her name was analyst grade, and her clearance was middling, and she worked in a windowless office of the Hero Public Safety Commission, and for 6 weeks she had been quietly assembling a folder that no one had asked her to assemble, out of items that individually meant nothing, and collectively had begun to keep her awake at night. A quirkless man of interest, flagged by Eraserhead, connected to thefts of quirk extraction hardware. A cluster of low-level powered criminals, gone missing from the underworld's own informal census. Not arrested, not surfaced dead, simply gone. Their quirks cataloged in the missing persons files, like items on a manifest. A pumping station bought through a shell chain that terminated, if you were patient and she was very patient, in accounts the commission had long since tagged as League of Villains adjacent. And, most recently, a report from a river district patrol of a sound in the night like a thunderclap from inside a building, investigated, dismissed, filed. She laid it all out for the commission's senior leadership in a briefing room with no windows and very good soundproofing, and she watched the temperature of the room drop as she talked. "We've been treating these as separate files," she said. "A quirkless burglar, a string of underworld disappearances, a League real estate purchase. I'm here to tell you, they're one file, and I'm here to tell you what I think it means, and I want to say in advance that I understand how it sounds." The senior official at the head of the table, a woman whose bandaged face and cold patience were legend inside the building and unknown outside it, folded her hands and said, "Say it anyway." So she said it. She walked them through the quirkless man Eraserhead couldn't categorize, through the extraction hardware, through the missing criminals, and the specific, deliberate variety of their quirks, offensive, defensive, mobility, utility, as though someone were assembling a set, through the pumping station and the thunderclap. And then she said the thing she had been afraid to write down for 3 weeks, because writing it down made it real. We assumed, when Eraserhead first flagged this, that we were looking at a second all-for-one. Someone stealing quirks to accumulate them, to become powerful. She drew a breath. I no longer believe that. All-for-One took quirks and kept them. The powers went into him. One man, one target we could eventually build a case around and a cell around, the way we did. This is different. Whoever this is isn't accumulating power in himself. Eraserhead confirmed he has no quirk at all and shows no sign of gaining one. He's taking quirks out of people and they're going somewhere else. And the somewhere else bought a fabrication facility. She looked around the table. I think he's not a thief. I think he's a manufacturer. I think he has found a way to take the quirk factor out of the flesh and put it somewhere it was never meant to go. And I think he's building units, devices, weapons, each one carrying a stolen quirk. And I think he can make more than one. The silence in the room had a texture to it. That's not possible, someone said finally. A senior man, reflexive, the way men say that's not possible about the thing they are most afraid is possible. The quirk factor requires a living substrate. It's the whole basis of, you can't just put a quirk in a box. It would. That's what our researchers say, sir, the analyst said. It's what All-for-One's own research assumed. He moved quirks between people, living to living. Everyone in the field agrees the factor needs the flesh. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. I'd point out that everyone in the field also agreed until about a year ago that the symbol of peace couldn't fall. Nobody answered that. Nobody could. The bandaged woman at the head of the table had not moved through any of it. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and even and terrible in its calm, and the room bent toward it. Walk it forward, she said. Assume you're right. Assume there is a man who can manufacture quirks into devices and reproduce them. Tell me what that means. Not for tonight. For everything. The analyst had walked it forward 100 times in the windowless dark of her own sleeplessness, and she did not hesitate. It means the end of us, she said simply. Not in a battle. Structurally. Everything the Commission exists to manage assumes power is scarce and personal. We track it from birth because it lives in bodies and bodies can be registered. We rank heroes because the powerful are few. We can contain a mighty villain because there's only ever one of him and one throat, one cell, one point of failure. Our entire architecture of control, licensing, ranking, registry, the whole edifice, is built on the biological accident that a power comes from inside a person and can't be copied. She spread her hands on the table, and they were not quite steady. Take that accident away. Let power be manufactured, reproducible, printable. And there's no registry, because you can't register a factory's output the way you register a birth. There's no containing the individual, because there is no individual. Kill the man and the schematic survives, or the machines keep running, or a second man reads the notebook. There's no ranking, because if anyone can be handed any power, then power stops being who you are and becomes what you can acquire. Every child born quirkless in this country, and we tell them that their lives are lesser because of an accident of birth, could be handed a power off a shelf. Every hero who worked and bled and trained for a rank could be matched by a machine off an assembly line. She looked up. We don't have a countermeasure for this, ma'am. Not a weak one, not a partial one. We have nothing, because we never imagined we'd need one. Our erasers erase the powered. Our jails hold the individual. Our law punishes the born and the thief. There is no box, anywhere in our entire apparatus, for a man whose power is that he knows how power works better than we do. Because that man, when we finally catch him and scan him, reads as an ordinary harmless old civilian, and the danger isn't in him at all. It's in what he's already written down. She stopped. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the bandaged woman said softly, into that silence, the thing that made it all real. So we can't cut off the head. Because there is no head, there's only the knowledge, and once it exists, she did not finish, because she did not have to. Once it exists, the analyst said, very quietly, it's like fire. You can't uninvent it. You can only try to be the one holding it. The bandaged woman closed her eyes for a moment, the only crack any of them would ever see in her, and when she opened them, her decision was already made, and it was cold, and it was pragmatic, and it was exactly the sort of decision the Commission was built to make, and would never, ever be asked to defend in the light. Then we do not merely stop him, she said. That's the trap the field keeps walking into, thinking of him as a villain to be caught. He's not a villain. He's a discovery. And you don't arrest a discovery. You acquire it. She turned to the senior man who had said it wasn't possible. I want him found. I want him alive, and I want his notebooks intact. And I want every scrap of what he's learned in a commission vault before it's in a courtroom, before it's in a newspaper, before a single hero outside this room knows what he can do. Because if the public learns that quirks can be manufactured, that the accident their whole society is built on can be undone, this country tears itself apart. The quirkless will demand to be given power. The powerful will refuse to lose their advantage. And every enemy we have, foreign and domestic, will move heaven and earth to get the schematic first. She stood. We are not fighting a man. We are in a race for a secret. And right now the only people winning it are the League of Villains, who are apparently too stupid to understand what they're holding. She was wrong about that last part, though she had no way to know it. The League understood exactly what they were holding. Or rather, Shigaraki Tomura believed he did. But the bandaged woman was right about the shape of it, right about all of it, right in the cold, sleepless way the analyst had been right. And as the briefing broke and the machinery of the Commission turned quietly toward a manhunt it dared not make public, both women understood the same buried thing, and neither said it aloud. They were not afraid of losing to the old man. They were afraid that stopping him would not be enough, that the door he had opened could not be closed, that somewhere out there in the industrial dark, an ordinary harmless-looking civilian had already written down the one thing that made everything they were, every rank, every registry, every license, every carefully maintained fiction about who deserved power and who was simply born without it, into a lie, waiting for the world to read. And they were right. All Might found out the way the public did, which was to say, badly, and in the street, with children watching. It was not supposed to reach the public at all. The Commission's manhunt had been quiet by design, a cold, pragmatic race for a secret run entirely in the dark. And it might have stayed quiet, might have ended with an old man and his notebooks vanishing into a Commission vault and the whole terrible discovery sealed away, if the two forces converging on Wily's work had not converged, badly, on the same afternoon, in the same river district, in front of everyone. The League moved first, and the League moved wrong. Shigaraki Tomura had spent weeks watching Wily build, and covetousness had done to the boy what it always did. It had made him impatient. He did not fully grasp the transcription process. Wily had been careful to keep the how of it locked in his own skull, sharing the what freely, and the method not at all. But Shigaraki had grasped enough to want more, faster, on his own terms, and when Wily refused, again, flatly, in the way that still made Dabi grin and Kurogiri's portals flex, the boy decided to demonstrate that the partnership had a senior partner, and it was not the old man. He took Ryusei, not by force. Wily had built safeguards, and Shigaraki wasn't fool enough to test them yet. He requested it, framed as a field trial, a chance to see what the machine could do against real heroes, and Wily, who wanted exactly that data, and had his own quieter reasons for letting the boy think he was in charge, agreed, with a private calculation running behind his mild old eyes that Shigaraki never saw. Wily wanted to know how a manufactured robot master performed against this world's top tier. He was willing to spend one to find out. And if the boy's recklessness spent it in a way that also drew the hero's attention to the League and away from a certain pumping station, well, Wily had let a supply theft go loud once before, to be found by the right people. He knew how to make a distraction look like someone else's mistake. So Ryusei went to the river district with a handful of League foot soldiers and orders from Shigaraki to make noise. And it made noise, and the noise brought heroes. And one of the heroes was a retired man in a too large suit who had come to that district for no reason at all except that he lived nearby now and walked there sometimes, in the afternoons, to be near ordinary people, while the ordinary people did not know who the hollow-cheeked stranger beside them had once been. Toshinori Yagi heard the first shockwave from 3 blocks away. He knew the sound of destruction the way a retired soldier knows gunfire, bone deep, faster than thought, and he was moving toward it before he had decided to move, his long, thin legs carrying his wasted frame through a scattering crowd, and the whole way there, the same cold litany ran through him that had run through him every day since Camino. "You can't! You have nothing left, one more hit," and the doctors said, "You can't." He had given the last of One for All to the boy. He had passed the torch. He was, now, exactly what the fallen symbol looked like up close. A sick man in a suit, with a hero's instincts and a civilian's body, and the cruelest thing about his retirement was that the instincts never retired with the power. He came around the corner into the river district and saw it, and for a moment his mind refused the sight. There was a machine in the street, tall, lean, dark-plated humanoid, and it was firing, projecting fists of compressed air that fell like meteors, buckling a storefront, punching a crater in the road, sending civilians sprawling and screaming for cover. That much All Might understood. He had fought 1,000 things that broke 1,000 streets. What he did not understand, what made his breath catch in his ruined lungs, was the quirk, because he had spent his whole life among quirks, had held the mightiest of them in his own body, and he knew, the way you know a language you were raised in, the feel of a power in the world. And this was a power, not a gadget, not a weapon that mimicked a power. An actual quirk, concussive force, expressing itself in the world with the unmistakable texture of the real thing, coming out of a machine. That's not possible, All Might thought, the exact reflexive thought the Commission's senior man had thought in a windowless room, the thought this world reached for like a handrail whenever the ground moved. And then, because Toshinori Yagi had spent his life running toward the impossible instead of away from it, the second thought came right behind it. And it's happening anyway. A child was down in the street. 6, maybe 7, knocked off her feet by a shockwave's edge, sitting stunned in the open with the machine turning, its optics tracking, its arm rising, the terrible patient targeting of something that never flinched and never tired, sighting on the nearest movement, which was her. And Toshinori Yagi, who had nothing left, who had been told by 3 doctors that one more strain on his gutted body could kill him, who was a retired man in a too large suit standing in a street full of people who did not know his name, did not hesitate for even the length of a heartbeat. He ran. There was no light around him. No swelling of muscle, no golden crackle, no United States of smash. There was only a sick man sprinting on legs that had no business sprinting, coughing blood before he was halfway there, throwing his gaunt frame across the open ground between the machine and the child, with nothing to protect either of them but the body he had left. He reached her. He got his arms around her and turned his back to the machine and hunched over her, making of his wasted body the only shield he had, and he waited for the shockwave that would break him, because a hero does not do the math on whether he can survive the save. A hero saves. The math is for afterward, if there is an afterward. The shockwave did not come, because someone else reached the machine first, a blur of gray, a whip of capturing cloth, and a pair of bloodshot eyes that fixed on the robot master's optics, with the full killing focus of the one quirk in this world, built to switch other quirks off. Aizawa Shota had been running this district for weeks, hunting an old man, and he had heard the thunderclap, and he had come, and he did the thing that had never once failed him. He erased it. He looked at the machine with everything he had, and reached for the quirk that was so plainly, impossibly there, and switched it off, and nothing happened. The machine's concussive quirk went on humming in the world exactly as before, because there was no nervous system for Aizawa's power to reach, no living substrate, no quirk factor in a person to silence, only a factor written into steel, expressing through an interface. Eraserhead's quirk could not so much as perceive, let alone cancel. Aizawa felt his own power pour out of him and find nothing to grip, the exact horror he had felt in the alley months ago with the quirkless old man, except 100 times worse, because this time, the thing his erasure couldn't touch was already trying to kill people. And in that half-second of Aizawa's failure, the two men in the street, the retired symbol curled over a child with his back bared, and the underground hunter's certainty draining from his face for the second time in his life, all might understood, all at once, the entire shape of the thing. It's a machine with a real quirk. Erasure can't touch it. That's why it's a machine. Someone built it so erasure can't touch it. Someone who understands exactly what we can and can't do. Someone who took a power out of a person and put it in a thing. The machine fired. Aizawa was already moving, throwing himself sideways with the child and the sick man both, capturing cloth lashing out to haul all three of them clear as the shockwave detonated the ground where they'd been, and they went down together in a tangle of gray cloth and blood and dust, and the machine turned to track them, patient, tireless, unerasable. And then it staggered, sparks fountaining from its shoulder joint, as a lance of blue-white flame took it in the side from across the street. Dabi, bored of the game, or perhaps under quiet instruction, had decided the field trial had produced enough data. The League foot soldiers were already melting back into the crowd. The machine, damaged, took its orders and turned to withdraw, laying down a retreating barrage that scattered the arriving heroes and bought the League their exit through a black warp of mist that opened in an alley and swallowed the whole retreat in an instant. And then it was over, in the way these things are always suddenly over, leaving a broken street and screaming and dust and the far-off wail of arriving sirens. Aizawa Shota lay in the rubble with a stunned child clutched to his chest and a dying legend gasping bloody beside him, and he stared at the space where the machine had been, and he said the thing out loud that the commission had said in its windowless room, and that he had felt in an alley months ago without letting himself believe it. It had a quirk, he rasped. It had a real quirk, and I couldn't. I looked right at it, and there was nothing to erase, because it isn't in anything. It's... He turned his head, and his bloodshot eyes found the ruined face of the man beside him, the retired symbol he had not even registered until now, and both of them understood the same thing at the same time, and neither of them wanted to be the one to say it. It was Toshinori Yagi who said it, coughing, cradling a crying child, a hero with no power left in a body that had spent everything, staring at the crater where a machine had stood, carrying a stolen human power that nothing in their world could switch off. Someone learned to make them, he whispered. God help us. Someone learned to make quirks, and they put the first one in a machine, specifically so that we couldn't stop it. Above them, unnoticed, a phone was already up. A civilian's phone, filming, the way there was always a phone. It had caught the machine. It had caught the shock waves, and the crater, and the tall, dark, unmistakably mechanical body, projecting an unmistakably real power into the world. Within the hour, it would be everywhere, and no windowless room, and no bandaged woman, and no cold, pragmatic plan to seal the secret in a vault would be able to call it back. The whole world was about to learn that a quirk could be built. And somewhere in a pumping station by the river, an old man watched the footage come in on a bank of salvaged screens, and studied the performance data streaming back from a damaged robot master, and did not gloat, and did not laugh, and only reached up, thoughtful, to coax the bent point of his mustache back toward true. The field trial had been a success. Every part of it, even the parts the boy thought were his idea. The footage broke the country in a single afternoon, and it broke it exactly along the fault line the bandaged woman had named in her windowless room. By evening it had a name the newsrooms had settled on because they needed something to put on the screen. The machine that had a quirk. The clip was everywhere. The tall, dark figure, the meteor fall of shockwaves, the crater in the River District Street, and beside it, endlessly, the analysis that the commission had spent weeks praying no one would arrive at in public. A hero physicist on a panel show, hedging every word, admitting under a host's pressure that yes, what the footage appeared to show was a genuine quirk effect with no living body producing it, and that if that were true, if, she stressed, if, then everything the public understood about where quirks came from was wrong. A retired hero on another channel saying the word no official would say, manufactured, and underneath all of it, spreading faster than any newsroom could shape it, the ordinary people of the country doing the arithmetic for themselves. Because the country was full of people for whom this arithmetic was not abstract. It was full of the quirkless, 4% of the population, give or take, millions of human beings who had been born into a world that had quietly, and sometimes not quietly, decided their lives were lesser, who had grown up hearing, in 1,000 small ways and a few enormous ones, that the accident of their birth had placed them at the bottom of a hierarchy they had done nothing to earn their place in, who had been passed over, pitied, bullied, told by well-meaning teachers to be realistic about their futures. And now the footage seemed to say, that the accident could be undone, that a power was not a fate written in the flesh, but a thing that could, apparently, be made and given. And a question detonated in the heart of every quirkless person who watched that clip, quiet and enormous and impossible to unask. If a machine can be given a quirk, why not me? The commission felt the ground go the moment the footage aired, and moved exactly as the bandaged woman had planned to move, and found that the plan was already obsolete. You could not seal a secret the whole country had watched on its phones. The race for the vault was lost before it started. What replaced it was worse and slower, and had no clean solution. The management of a population that had just learned the foundational fact of its own society might be a lie, and that somewhere out there was a man who knew how to prove it. And into that vacuum, before the commission could shape the story, before the heroes could offer the public any comfort, a message arrived. It arrived everywhere at once, pushed onto screens through channels the League's people had cracked open, unpolished, deliberately crude, the theater of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that a villain's speech mattered as much as a villain's weapon. And it was not Shigaraki Tomura who spoke it, though Shigaraki had wanted to. Wily had, with the flat certainty that still baffled the boy, simply taken the microphone. This was his argument. He had been building to it since a flooded machine shop. He would be the one to make it. He did not appear on camera as a monster. That was the terrible cleverness of it. He appeared as exactly what Aizawa's erasure had always found, an ordinary old man, white hair combed up into 2 soft horns, mustache neat, seated calmly, speaking mildly, a grandfather explaining something patient and reasonable to a frightened room. "You've seen the machine," he said. "You've been told to be afraid of it. I'd like to offer you a different word for what you saw, and the word is possible. For all of history, your world has run on an accident. A power grows in some bodies and not others, by no logic, no justice, no desert, chance, only chance. And around that accident you built everything. You built heroes, and you built rankings, and you built the quiet, cruel arithmetic that a child born without a quirk is a child born less. You told those children to be realistic. You told them the accident was fate, and fate could not be argued with. He leaned very slightly toward the camera. I am here to tell you that fate can be engineered, that the accident was only ever an accident of delivery, and that everything you were told was impossible was only ever impossible because no one who understood how power actually works had bothered to try. He let it sit. He was very good at letting things sit. They will tell you I'm a villain. They'll tell you to fear me. And they'll tell you that what I've made is a weapon. And they won't be entirely wrong. I've made no secret of my quarrel with the people who run this world. But ask yourself who is truly frightened of what you saw and why. The quirkless child watching this is not frightened. The quirkless child watching this just saw, for the first time in their life, a reason to hope. It's the powerful who are frightened. The ranked, the licensed, the ones who sit at the top of the hierarchy the accident built, they are frightened, because if power can be made and given, then their power stops being who they are and becomes merely what they have. And what one man can have, another can be given. I have not threatened a single quirkless person in this country. I have threatened only the scarcity that kept them down. Decide for yourselves which of us the heroes are really protecting when they come to stop me. And then he was gone, the message ending as crudely as it began, and the country was left holding it, and the country did not hold it as one thing. It held it as a fracture, exactly as the bandaged woman had feared, exactly along the line she'd named. Because the awful thing, the thing that made the heroes work so much harder than a simple villain would have made it, was that the old man was not simply lying. Threaded through the theater and the menace and the plain villainy of a man arming machines to attack cities was a splinter of something true, and everyone who heard it felt the splinter go in. Hero society was built on an accident. It did tell quirkless children they were less. The rankings were a hierarchy of luck dressed up as merit. Stain had said a version of it, years ago in Blood, that hero society had rotted, that it rewarded the wrong things. Dobby's whole tragedy was a version of it, and now here was a man saying the most seductive version of all. Not only is your society unjust, I can hand you the thing it unjustly denied you. The commission's response was swift and cold and made everything worse in the specific way that cold institutional responses always do. They declared the footage's implications unconfirmed. They declared the manufacture of Quirks a dangerous fiction, even as their own physicists privately confirmed it, even as everyone could see it. They moved to suppress, to reassure, to manage, and every act of suppression read, to a public that had watched the clip with its own eyes, as exactly what it was, the powerful, protecting their monopoly on power. Every denial fed the old man's argument. Every reassurance from a ranked hero sounded, to a quirkless teenager who had spent 18 years at the bottom, like the top of the ladder telling the bottom to stay put. And the heroes, the actual heroes, the ones who went into burning buildings, the ones who did the work, were caught in the worst place of all, and All Might felt it most keenly of anyone. He sat in a small apartment with the news playing and the phone footage looping, and a cup of tea going cold in his ruined hands. And Toshinori Yagi wrestled with a thing that his whole life had never once prepared him to wrestle with. He had given his life to a simple and beautiful idea, that a hero stands between the public and the dark, and holds, and by holding gives everyone else the courage to smile. It had never occurred to him to ask whether the society behind him deserved the holding. He had never needed to ask. The villains he fought had always been simply villains. Cruelty, greed, the will to dominate. And standing against them had never required him to defend the fine print of hero society, only to defend people, ordinary frightened people, from those who would hurt them. But this old man had not attacked people. Not really. He had attacked the scarcity. And in the terrible splinter of truth in the old man's words, Toshinori heard something he could not simply punch, because there was nothing to punch, only a question. And the question was aimed at the foundation of everything he had stood on for 40 years. What is a hero? The question went. If the thing that made heroes special was only ever an accident of birth, what were we defending all that time? People or a hierarchy? And if a man offers to end the hierarchy, to hand the quirkless child at the bottom the power the accident denied her, then when I stand against him, whose side am I truly on? He did not have an answer. That was the thing that frightened him more than any machine. In 40 years of standing against the dark, Toshinori Yagi had never once faced a foe who made him unsure which way he was facing. He was sure the old man was dangerous. He was sure the machines would kill, were killing, would be turned to conquest and not liberation, that whatever splinter of truth the man wrapped his weapons in, the man himself wanted power and vengeance and not justice. He was sure of all that. He was not sure the man was wrong about the society at his back. And a hero who is not sure what he is defending is a hero standing on cracked ground. And Toshinori Yagi had already learned, at Camino, exactly what it felt like when the ground you had always stood on turned out to be able to break. He set the cold tea down. He looked at his own thin hands, the hands that had held the mightiest quirk in the world and given it away, and for the first time in his long life, the retired symbol of peace, understood that the fight coming was not going to be won by the strongest arm. It was going to be won, or lost, in the answer to a question: what makes a hero, if not the luck of what you were born with? And the old man in the pumping station had made certain, with a single mild and reasonable speech, that every quirkless child in the country was now waiting to hear how the heroes answered it. They had better, Toshinori thought, find an answer worth those children hearing, because the doctor had already given them his. The hero's answer, when it finally came, did not come as a speech. It came as an assault, because the commission had run out of speeches, and because Wily had run out of patience with being the guest of a boy who thought he was the host. The break with the league happened first, and it happened the way Wily had always known it would, which was why he had prepared for it since the flooded machine shop. Shigaraki Tomura had watched an old man take his microphone, make his argument, and become the face of the most destabilizing thing to hit hero society since All for One, and none of it had been about the league. It had been about the doctor. Shigaraki had held the ladder believing he was climbing it, and the country's terror and the quirkless children's hope, and the cracks running through the whole civilization, all bore one man's fingerprints, and they were not the boy's. Covetousness curdled into something colder. Shigaraki decided, at last, that the old man had stopped being useful and reached, as he had promised he would, that first night in the flooded dark, to turn the doctor to dust in his sleep. He found the pumping station empty of its master and full of its master's children. Wily was not there. Wily was never, after that first alley with the eraser, anywhere his enemies expected him to be. He had learned impatience's price once and never paid it twice. What Shigaraki found instead, when he came through Kurogiri's mist with Dabi at his shoulder and murder in his chapped hands, was a fabrication floor full of finished robot masters, standing dark and silent in their ranks, and a single screen that flickered to life as the warp closed behind him. "You reached for the leash," the old man's voice said, mild as ever from the screen. "I did tell you what would happen. I'm genuinely a little disappointed in you, boy. I gave you every chance to be half as clever as your master, and you couldn't manage even that. Your master would have understood that you don't move against the man who holds the only copy of the thing you want before you've taken the thing out of his head. He'd have been patient. He'd have waited until he had my notebooks. You just walked into my workshop, alone but for one man, to kill me. And I'm not here, and they are." The robot masters opened their optics all at once. What followed, Wily watched from a safe distance on his salvaged screens, and it was the second field trial, and it answered the question the first had only begun to. His machines against Shigaraki Tomura and Dabi, an apex villain and a walking bonfire, the coming terror of hero society, and the machines did not win, quite. Shigaraki's decay unmade whatever it touched, spreading through steel as readily as flesh, and Dabi's blue flame cooked joints and warped plating, and the two of them cut their way out through Wily's ranks with a raw lethality that made them what they were. But it cost them. It cost them badly. They came through Kurogiri's rescuing mist, scorched and staggered and short, a great deal of the swagger they'd arrived with, and behind them a dozen manufactured quirks had made the two mightiest of the league bleed, machines that no erasure could switch off, no theft could disarm, and that their maker could simply build again, tomorrow, in numbers, while Shigaraki Tomura could only ever be one boy with one pair of ruined hands. Wily had learned exactly what he needed. His army could hurt this world's apex, and it was expendable in a way this world's apex was not. He did not mourn the machines he'd lost. He had more. That was the entire point of everything he was. The Commission's assault came 3 days later, and it was everything the Leagues had not been: coordinated, overwhelming, and built by an institution that had finally, correctly, understood what it was facing. They had found the pumping station. The League's clumsy attack had lit it up on every sensor in the district, and they did not send a hero to arrest a villain, because the bandaged woman had been right, that there was no villain to arrest, only a discovery to seize. They sent a strike force built for the specific, impossible problem of a man whose weapons could not be erased. Aizawa was there, and had made his peace with the uselessness of his own quirk against the machines. He had spent the 3 days learning, instead, to fight them as machines. Joints, sensors, power cores, the mechanical vulnerabilities of a thing that, whatever quirk it carried, was still built and could be unbuilt. Endeavor was there, the number one, Hellflame banked and ready. Because if erasure was useless, then overwhelming force was the answer, and there was no more overwhelming force left standing in this world with all might hollowed out. Mirko was there, and Best Genist, and a hard-eyed contingent of the Commission's own quiet operators whose job was not the fighting but the notebooks, the seizure of the schematics, the acquisition of the discovery, the part of the plan that mattered more than the man. And All Might was there, not to fight. He could not fight, but he had asked to be present, and the Commission, weighing the symbol of him against the risk, had permitted it, because a country coming apart at the seams needed to see the symbol of peace standing with the heroes, even if the symbol of peace was a sick man in a suit who could not throw a single punch. They hit the pumping station at dawn, and Wily, because Wily was not a fool, and had known this was coming since the country broke, and had prepared for the heroes with the same patience he'd prepared for the boy, met them with an army. It was the largest battle the River District had ever seen, and the strangest, and the most frightening, because for the first time in the history of Hero Society, the heroes were fighting an enemy that their entire 100-year apparatus was fundamentally not built to fight. Erasure did nothing. There was no single villain to overwhelm. Every robot master they broke was one of dozens, and behind the dozens, everyone understood, was a schematic that could make dozens more. Endeavor's Hellflame reduced machine after machine to slag, a number one hero fighting at the absolute peak of his power, and it was enough to win the battle, and not enough to matter, because he was one man burning down one factory's output, while the man who could print more factories watched from somewhere safe. Aizawa's new tactics worked. The machines could be unbuilt, and it was exhausting, brutal, hours of it. Heroes fighting not a monster but an assembly line, and feeling, all of them, the truth of the thing settle into their bones as they fought. We can win this, and winning this changes nothing, because we are fighting the machines, and the enemy is the knowledge, and you cannot punch a fact. Wily lost the battle. He had always expected to lose the battle. He lost it the way a chess player sacrifices a rook, because the battle was never the game. The heroes broke into the pumping station at last, through a firestorm of manufactured quirks and Endeavor's answering flame, and they seized it, and the Commission's quiet operators went straight for the vault where the notebooks should have been. The vault was empty. Of course it was empty. There was a single sheet of paper in it, in a cramped, brilliant shorthand only one man alive could read. And when they finally decoded it, days later, it said only, "You were always going to win the fight. You were never going to win the argument. Ask the quirkless children which of us they're rooting for. AWW." And the doctor was gone. Through means no one ever fully reconstructed, a bolt hole, a decoy, a machine built for nothing but carrying its maker out through the chaos while every hero in the district was busy with the army he'd left as a curtain. Albert Wily walked out of the largest hero operation in the district's history with the only thing that had ever mattered intact, which was the inside of his own skull. The notebooks the Commission seized were real, and were decoys both. Real enough to prove quirks could be manufactured, decoy enough to be missing the one step, the transcription method, the how, that Wily had never once written down anywhere but in his own memory. The Commission had seized the proof and lost the secret. They had won the battle, and confirmed, in winning it, the exact thing they had gone to war to bury, that it was real, that it was possible, that a quirk could be built. All Might stood in the smoking ruin of the pumping station as the sun came up over the river, among the slagged and broken bodies of machines that had carried real human powers, and watched the Commission's operators come out of the empty vault with their faces gone gray, and understood that the heroes had just fought the largest battle of the post-Camino age, and settled nothing at all. The doctor was loose, the secret was out, the proof was undeniable, and somewhere in the country, right now, a quirkless child was watching the footage of the heroes storming a factory to destroy the machines that had been given the very thing that child had been denied at birth, and was drawing exactly the conclusion the old man had wanted that child to draw. Toshinori Yagi looked at the empty vault, and the slagged machines, and the risen sun, and felt the ground he had stood on for 40 years finish cracking beneath his feet. They had won. They had lost. Both were true, and both would stay true, and there was no United States of Smash in the world that could make either of them false. In the months that followed, the country learned to live with a door it could not close. That was the shape of the doctor's victory, and it was a strange shape, because by every conventional measure, Albert Wily had lost. He had no fortress. The heroes had slagged it. He had no army. Endeavor had burned it. He had no league. Shigaraki Tomura, scorched and humiliated and now aware that the old man had played him from the first night in the flooded dark, had declared the league's business with the doctor finished and meant it. Wily was, once again, exactly what he had been the night he arrived, an old man alone in an alien world with nothing but the inside of his own skull. And the inside of his own skull was the only thing that had ever mattered, and the whole world knew it now. That was the difference. When Wily had arrived, the secret had lived only in him, unproven, dismissible, the delusion of a quirkless vagrant. Now it lived in everyone. The footage was permanent. The Commission's own seized notebooks, leaked in pieces despite every effort to contain them, had confirmed the impossible thing in the sober language of engineering. A quirk factor could be transcribed off the flesh and made to function in a built substrate. The how was still missing. Wily's method remained locked where it had always been, in a memory no vault held. But the weather was settled forever. It could be done. Someone had done it. And a thing that has been done once can be done again, and the world's every research institution, every government, every ambitious lab and desperate power now knew exactly what prize was waiting for whoever reconstructed the step the doctor had never written down. The Commission understood, at last, the full cruelty of what had happened to them. They had gone to war to seize a secret and keep it buried, and in fighting the war they had broadcast it. Every hero who had stormed the pumping station, every camera that had filmed the battle, every slagged machine dragged out of the ruin, had been another proof shown to the world. The bandaged woman had said it in a windowless room before any of it began. You cannot cut off the head, because there is no head. There is only the knowledge, and once it exists, you can only try to be the one holding it. And she had been right. And being right had not saved her, because the knowledge now existed in 10,000 places, and the doctor had made certain it would. Hero Society did not fall. That was not the doctor's victory either, and Wily, wherever he was, would have been the first to say so, with a dry contempt for anyone who expected a civilization to collapse in a season. Civilizations are stubborn. The rankings still ranked. The licenses still licensed. Endeavor still stood at the top of a list, and heroes still went into burning buildings, and the ordinary machinery of a society ground on the way ordinary machinery does. But something under it had changed, and would never change back. The quirkless were not the same. They could not be, having seen what they had seen. The quiet, cruel arithmetic that had told them for 100 years that their lives were lesser, that the accident of their birth was a fate beyond argument. That arithmetic had a crack running through it now that no reassurance could seal, because a man had stood on every screen in the country and shown them the accident could be undone. Some of them organized, some of them agitated, some of them simply carried themselves differently, having been handed, by a villain, the one thing Hero Society had never given them, the idea that the bottom of the ladder was not where they belonged, only where they had been put. And the heroes had still not answered the question. That was the wound the doctor had left that would not close. All Might had known, sitting with cold tea and looping footage, that the fight would be won or lost in the answer to what makes a hero, if not the luck of what you were born with. And the heroes had won the fight and never answered the question. And a question that goes unanswered does not go away. It waits. It sits in every quirkless child who saw the footage. It sits in every ranked hero who now, in an honest moment, wonders whether the thing that made them special was ever earned. Stain had put a blade to Hero Society's throat and made it flinch. Dabby had set it on fire from the inside. But the doctor had done something quieter and more permanent than either. He had made Hero Society doubt its own foundation, and left before anyone could make him take it back. Toshinori Yagi understood this most clearly of anyone, because he had spent his life as the foundation, and he was the one who finally decided that the answer could not be left to the commission, or to a manhunt, or to the hope that the doctor would simply never resurface. On a gray afternoon near the river where it had all begun, the retired symbol of peace stood in front of a small gathering. Not a press conference, nothing so grand, just students and a few young heroes, and the child he had shielded with his broken body, older now, unhurt, and he gave the closest thing to an answer that the heroes ever managed. He did not defend the rankings. He did not defend the commission. He did not tell the quirkless children that the accident of their birth was fair, because it was not, and Toshinori Yagi had never in his life been able to say a thing he did not believe. Instead, he told them, in the plain and shining way that had once made a whole country feel safe, that the doctor had been right about one thing and catastrophically wrong about another. Right that a hero was never made by the luck of a power. Wrong that a hero was made by having one at all. He had given his own power away, he reminded them. He stood before them now with nothing, a sick man in a suit, and he had run into that street at the beginning of all this with no quirk left in his body, and thrown himself over a child, because that was the thing the doctor's whole argument could not touch. A quirk could be born, or stolen, or, now, built, but the choice to stand between the frightened and the dark, that could not be manufactured. That had never come out of the flesh. That came from somewhere the doctor's instruments would never find, because the doctor had spent his whole brilliant life looking for the source of power in the wrong place, in cells and factors and schematics, and had never once understood that the thing that made a hero was not a power at all. It was not a complete answer. Toshinori knew it was not. It did not fix the arithmetic or heal the quirkless children's wound or close the door the doctor had opened. But it was an honest answer, offered by a man with nothing left to offer but honesty. And it was the beginning of the long work, the work of building a hero society worth the name the doctor had exposed it as not yet deserving. And somewhere out in the wide world, an old man with white hair combed up into two soft horns heard about the speech, because he made a point of hearing about everything, and he considered it, and he was not entirely displeased. He was not caught. He was not going to be caught, not for a long while. A man who reads as harmless to every instrument a civilization possesses is a difficult man to find, and Albert Wily had spent his whole life learning to be difficult to find. He had lost his fortress and his army and his uneasy alliance, and he had lost none of the only thing that had ever mattered. He was already working. In some quiet place, on the back of some stranger's unpaid invoices, in the cramped, brilliant shorthand only he could read, he was already sketching the next line. Better than the last. Always better than the last, because the argument was not finished, and Dr. Wily had never once in his long and spiteful and magnificent life walked away from an argument he had already begun to win. The door was open. It would stay open, and the man who had opened it was still out there, patient as a mechanism, with 40 years of unmatched genius behind his eyes and a whole civilization's certainties lying cracked at his feet, waiting, the way he had always waited, for the world to finish reading the thing he had written down. The heroes had answered the doctor's question at last, or begun to. Somewhere in the country, a quirkless child heard the retired symbol's speech and stood a little straighter, not because a power was coming for them, but because a broken old hero had told them the thing they were stug was never the thing that had been missing. And far away, an old man with 2 horns of white hair bent over a stranger's invoice and began, once again, to build. Between those two, the child and the doctor, the future of a whole world would be decided, and neither of them, not the child learning to hope, nor the genius learning nothing at all, had any intention of stopping, because a discovery, once made, cannot be unmade, and an argument, once begun, must be finished. Somewhere in Musutafu, The ground the heroes stood on had cracked, and would not uncrack, and a door that could not be closed stood open to a world that would never again be quite so certain of who deserved to be powerful, and who had only ever been told they didn't.